Okay, good afternoon. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here and join you today at the 25th Seoul International Financial Forum. Here is my title: Is Standardization the Key to Unlocking Continued Sustainable Growth of International Trade and Domestic and International Financial Services? I'll just get my reading glasses on. I'm not as young as I used to be, and I need to use my glasses on occasions such as this. So I've once been in Seoul before. I was giving a short course to staff at the Bank of Korea. It was a very pleasurable visit, and I was left with the warmest impressions of this city. I really loved it here. But I was thinking as I was preparing for my talk today, what can I contribute to this discussion of financial alliance? Now, I've worked on three main areas of research during a 40-year career. As a scholar and researcher, I've looked at what's called macro finance, so it's how the banking system interacts with the broader economy. On financial regulation and risk management, for example, I wrote a book on the financial crisis of 2007-2008. But this talk will draw on my third area of research, which is the operational arrangements that underpin finance and banking and financial markets. And this is where I see tremendous opportunities for financial alliance. So what I'm going to talk about today is how can financial alliance support the agreement, the development, and the promotion of common global technical operational standards, especially common data standards. Now, I'm an economist, so I like to think in terms of costs and benefits. So I'm going to talk about the great benefits that can come, but let me leave that to a little bit later on in my talk. Let me first of all explain how I'm going to discuss things over the rest of this half an hour. So first I'm going to talk about the economics of standardization, why it's a really quite challenging economic problem. Then I'm going to make some comparisons with telecommunications on the one hand and financial services on the other. And then I really want to highlight some practical examples. I mean, I'm a university professor, but I'm one of those professors who thinks it's important to work with practitioners, with industry, with policymakers. So I'd like to try and keep things as practical as possible. And finally, I'm going to comment on the challenges that will need to be overcome and the role of financial alliance to achieve this goal, promoting better common operational standards. Okay, there are many financial conferences around the world. I've been to so many, I've lost count of how many conferences I've been to. And they're all about networking and a chance to think about the future of the industry. So this is my first task, to talk about the economics of standards. Now, it's a very substantial subject in itself. I could give you a whole university module on standards. But let's try and give a brief overview. Now, most of the time, we think of banking, financial markets, derivative markets as all about competition. For those of you who, like me, studied economics at university, it's the textbook model of perfect competition. We think of that being what applies in many cases in finance. There are thousands of banks, brokers, wealth managers, insurance companies, and they spend almost all their time and effort, as they should do, on trying to make money, to sell products and services, and investigate new opportunities where the prospective returns justify and compensate for the risks involved. But financial alliance is all about, in my view, about recognizing the limitations of that view of finance as all about competition. It's thinking about it more from a perspective of cooperation. And there are many well-known weaknesses to this simple model of competition. First, of course, barriers to entry. In many countries, and the UK is one, there are a few large banks which do most. Now, fintech is changing that a bit. We have challenger banks, we have new providers of financial services. But it's still true that the big banks have a very substantial market position. They have what we call market power. And that's a concern from an economics point of view. Are they raising prices above competitive levels? Are they giving consumers and clients and customers more expensive products and services than they really might be. A second weakness, again, economists will know this very well about, are information problems. And those rise a lot in financial services. So they can undermine the quality or the suitability of goods and services. They can also result in instability and financial failures and potential systemic financial risk. And a third weakness, which must be mentioned in the context of financial alliance, are so-called externalities. So in economic terms, that means when the economic costs are not automatically borne by producers, and where not all the benefits automatically accrue to the paying customers. And the most obvious example, very relevant to today, are environmental externalities. And in particular, the burning of fossil fuels and their contribution to climate change, which is, of course, an issue for all of us, but especially for the younger generation. Okay, all that's well known. Barriers to entry, information problems, externalities. But my talk is really focusing on a fourth area of weakness of the competitive model. And I describe that as market infrastructure, because markets do not operate in a vacuum. So this question of better standards, operational standards, data standards, is about improving the infrastructure on which markets rely. Markets do not exist in a vacuum. They depend on several market infrastructures. So first, the legal institutions, which allow households and firms to assert property rights, enter into contracts, and be relied on to fulfill them. Second, physical and communication infrastructures, ports, roads, railways, telecommunications, mail services. The systems of financial exchange, our markets themselves, and financial reporting. That's three. Then fourth, we have education and health services. We've got to train staff. We can't just take people straight out of primary school and expect them to be productive workers. And we have to invest and maintain our human capital. But that can't be appropriated by firms. So again, it's a form of market infrastructure. And fifth, agreement on, and this is my main subject today, agreement on and adoption of technical standards, ensuring that different economic goods and services are combined effectively together. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm running out of fingers. I could actually continue this list. I could probably get up to 10 if I really tried. Market infrastructures really matter. But my focus is on one of these infrastructures, and it's about technical operating standards, especially data standards. Okay, time is moving quickly. So let me just summarize and then move on. So what I've suggested is that financial alliance is about overcoming the weaknesses of competitive markets, because there are indeed problems with the standard model of market competition. And I've asserted that a particularly critical weakness, which doesn't get all the attention it deserves, is providing the appropriate infrastructures within which markets operate. And within that, operational and data standards are key. Therefore, they're an appropriate end of financial alliance. I should have another slide. Right, this is the meat of my talk. We've had the starter. This is the meat. So I'm going to make five fingers, 5 main points. The first is far from being unique to me. I want to compare the seamless provision. We're all used to smartphones, to online purchases. I'm sure it's similar here in Korea. In the UK, I needed something for my visit. I was leaving on the Sunday. Friday, I could order it online. On Saturday, Amazon delivered it. It's so quick and easy nowadays. And we're used to so many things digital being seamless, and they're not always perfect, but most of the time they are. There's a fashionable term, Web 3.0 is sometimes used in this context. Actually, it's a little bit of a hype term. I think it's used a bit too loosely, but it does contain something pretty important. It's about the promised further improvement on the internet with much greater automation, and there are many elements to this. Part of it is what's known as the semantic web, that the web should understand us, but through the building blocks of language. That's promoted by Tim Berners-Lee, for example. There's something called blockchain, which many of you will have heard about. Again, there's a lot of hype in blockchain. I think it's often overstated. But the basic idea of shared data, which we access through cryptographic keys, cryptographic encryption, I think is an important one. And then potentially the widespread application of artificial intelligence, of which there are many forms of artificial intelligence, but clearly it can automate a lot of activities which previously have been manual. So I'm going to go into one example. Again, I could give a whole talk just on this topic. So first a warning, I always tell my students, and I'll tell you as well, don't invest in crypto. It's a complete zero-sum game. There's no real underlying economic value. But crypto gives us some interesting examples. And if you do engage in crypto investment, I don't myself personally, you might do that using what's known as a decentralized finance protocol. An example is Uniswap. Now, if this gets a bit technical, if you get a bit lost, don't worry. There's a simple point at the end. It's not central, but I'd like to make this illustration. The key feature of crypto investment in DeFi, using, for example, Uniswap, in contrast to the bad news about crypto is often to do with exchanges like FTX, which failed in 2022, Binance or Coinbase, which are obviously a bit better than FTX, but they have their own issues. The problem with those exchanges is, in a sense, they're antithetical to the ideas of Web 3.0. The idea of Web 3.0 is that we should not rely on institutions, or much less reliance. It should be decentralized. And if you invest through Uniswap, that's exactly what you get. That you can buy and sell crypto on a decentralized exchange, and there are no intermediaries involved. Your money is much safer than it would have been with FTX, and I would assert more safer than with Binance or Coinbase. Now contrast that with existing financial arrangements. I, like all of us, I keep most of my money in a UK bank, a subsidiary of HSBC, also with Monzo. On the whole, it's safe and accessible. I'm protected by deposit insurance, great. But I don't directly control my money. I depend on the bank to provide a good service on my behalf. I can knock on the door and say, "Where's my money?" But that's not a meaningful question. They give me money when I ask for it, but it's essentially their money and an obligation to fulfill the deposit contract with me. The vision of Web 3.0 is that the money that's looked after by financial institutions remains your own money. It's a bit more like a custodial arrangement where they keep the money in a safe and they move it around as you instruct them. But if anything goes wrong, for example, if the bank fails, the money is immediately yours. And if you want to move it to another bank because you're not happy with their service, you can move it straight away, seamlessly. It shifts the balance of power from the provider, the bank, to the customer, the deposit holder. If I'm not happy with the service, then I can use my private keys. There are many complications. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but I'm going to go on next to a homely example. I think you might recognize this company. I want to go a bit closer to practical reality. Now, why Samsung? There's a personal reason. My stepson, it so happens, is a Samsung employee. Not here in Korea, in Finland. And he requires and asks that whenever I buy a piece of kit, a television or a mobile phone or whatever, it should always be Samsung, of course. It's sort of almost like the family firm. And in order to ensure harmonious family relations, I thought it was a very good idea if I used Samsung as an example for this talk. But it so happens it fits very naturally. It's not just that Samsung is a leading Korean company. It's a major global player in telecommunications. And telecommunications rely heavily on standards in order to work. So what I really want to do is make the comparison between telecommunications and companies like Samsung on the one hand, and leading financial companies, big financial institutions on the other, like HSBC, where I bank. So to give you one example, the development of 5G mobile telephony. Samsung hosted two of the key conferences that developed that technology in Busan. I think it was back in 2016 and 2018, working with the 3GPP partnership, which developed all of that. So I've conducted research over the years on standard setting, particularly in financial services, and there's a huge contrast. In financial services, standard setting is kind of like an afterthought. Yes, most banks have a few standard specialists, but it's not their day job. It's, okay, do a bit of this in the evening or weekends. Samsung, by contrast, has full-time employees who work just on technical standards. It's a very striking contrast. Standards are not taken particularly seriously as a central part of the business model. It's a kind of operational afterthought. There are areas where standard setting is much more central. I've done quite a lot of work with SWIFT, the international financial messaging company, and standards are very important to them. I'll talk about one of their standards in a moment. So let me come on to my reasoning why standards are so important from an economics point of view. It'll also help you understand why financial institutions are not always so enthusiastic. First, standardization lowers operating costs. Obviously, it aids communication as well. But when it lowers operating costs, it reduces barriers to entry. So firms can be a bit reluctant to support standardization because they can see, hang on, that's my own lunch that's being taken away from me. So there's a certain reluctance in financial services to embrace standardization, even though we need that for the overall benefit of clients and customers. Standardization can overcome problems of transparency. So it actually deals with some of the major problems of the competitive market in financial services. It can also help with risk management. It increases awareness of market credit and liquidity risks. And this is particularly relevant to financial alliance in the context of climate change. Data standardization is key to monitoring the uses made of loans and investments, taking account of their wider environmental and social impacts. I'm a bit short of time, so I'm not going to do everything I've prepared. I was going to mention international collaboration between Korea, the European Union, and to an extent the UK. I'll just mention there was a major conference about standard setting in telecommunications, in computer chips, and in other areas just a year ago today, but it didn't mention financial services. I think it should be usefully prioritized. Okay, let me come on to SWIFT. So this is an admirable example of SWIFT. So a little bit of bias here. I've done a lot of work with SWIFT over the past decade and a half. So I know SWIFT and the work they do very well. And they are the approved body, approved for operating one of the most important of financial services standards, ISO 20022, which is coming to be used in all areas of payments and securities market transactions. And it's the responsibility of a committee of ISO, the International Standards Organization, to which the Korean Standards Association belongs, so does the British Standards Institute. And it's their committee, ISO 068, which is responsible for this standard. SWIFT is the so-called registration body. Since its launch in 2004, so it's 20 years old now, ISO has been, by 2019, it was a quite slow start and then accelerating. By 5 years ago, it was used in large value retail payments and securities settlement in 70 countries around the world. It's been critical for the development of so-called faster payments, because the ISO 20020 standard naturally facilitates what we're now coming to take for granted, the possibility to move money almost instantaneously from one bank account to another, regardless of whether it's in the same institution. Okay, I hope you're still with me. There's 10 minutes left. I hope I haven't exhausted you yet, and you're still following what I've got to say. We're not too far from the end now, nearly done. I want to briefly mention 3 ongoing standards initiatives. So that's the next slide. Now, these won't be perhaps familiar. I'd be interested to know how many of you in the audience have even heard of these 3 initiatives. But I think all 3 are critically important for the future sustainable growth of financial services and the global economy. So I think all 3 of these deserve a great deal of attention. You know, they should be discussed at ministerial level, at policy level, and yet they remain, because they're kind of back office, because they're operations, not looked at enough. So the first is the global LEI. I was involved in early discussions of this. I know many of the individuals who've developed the LEI. I know the leadership of the Global LEI Foundation. What is it? It's a number which is particularly useful for automatic processing, because there are hundreds of legal companies within every large financial institution. I think JP Morgan, I was told, has something like 700 legal institutions just within JP Morgan. I imagine there's a JP Morgan Korea, but there's all sorts of versions of that large. So when you're dealing with JP Morgan, from a legal and operational point of view, it matters which of the 700 different flavors of JP Morgan are you actually dealing with. The global LEI solves that problem. It means you just need to make sure you agree this is the right entity that we're dealing with as a counterparty, that we're using for... and then you can build that into all your systems so that processing of financial transactions and so on can be pretty much automated. The first LEI issuance was in 2017, and it's grown rapidly. There are now over 2.6 million companies worldwide registered with LEIs. But the operational adoption is still only partial. It's kind of got halfway there, in my view. It's reported for some aspects of regulatory reporting, for example, over-the-counter derivatives, but it's not universally used, as it surely should be, in all aspects of regulation. They're not ubiquitously linked to corporate financial accounts, which continue to employ textual identifiers. There are huge opportunities building on, and there's also huge opportunities for lowering the costs of KYC and CFT, counter-financing of terrorism operations. Big costs. So well established, but some way short of its full potential. My second example is the Actus project. Again, I'm in close touch with some of the leadership of this. It's a system for automatic computation of risk exposures, portfolio and institutional risk exposures. So what it does is it provides standard contract types. It's a kind of, if you like, it's a kind of terminology or a semantic standard, or taxonomy, which allows risk managers in firms to quickly and automatically calculate their portfolio risks. It's also particularly useful for regulatory reporting, to get rid of all the large amounts of time that are spent in, responding to the demands of regulators to know what's going on. But like the LEI, it lacks sufficient support. It should be used much more widely. Then it would save us a great deal of time. Oops, I've gone too far. Keep to this one. My third one, again, I'll mention this very briefly, is the ICI Digital Standards. Sorry, it should be ICC. Typo, my apologies. It's the International Chamber of Commerce, which they have something like 400,000, I think it is, corporate members worldwide. There is a ICC Korea, ICC UK, and in all the other major countries. And they're particularly focused on international trade. They play a major role in resolving international trade disputes. They're involved representing their corporate members in international trade negotiations, and more recently, they've become heavily involved in a program to make trade, international trade, paperless rather than digital. Again, there are huge potential benefits. One paper commissioned by the ECC suggests that amongst the G7 plus South Korea, the introduction of their digital standards initiative could increase global trade amongst the G7 plus Korea countries by $9 trillion. You heard me right, $9 trillion, not billion. So that's several percent. It's something like 6 or 7% of GDP, global GDP, in terms of increased global trade. Now those numbers are a little bit of a sketch. More detailed research is needed. But there are simply huge economic gains, particularly for smaller countries, particularly for emerging and low-income countries. If South Korea wants to do a lot more trade regionally with all the countries in East and Southeast Asia, then this global digital DSI, ICC, Digital Standards Initiative, I think is critical and should be pursued. But again, there's not enough attention to it. Okay, I'm very near the end. I'm going the wrong way. One more. Made it. So I've tried to be very positive. I've said there are huge benefits from standardization. But I have to also give a slightly negative perspective on this as an economist, because this isn't easy to do. And there are two main reasons. The first is coordination. Standards cost money. If you ask a bank or a large corporate to implement a new standard, any of the ones I've mentioned, within their systems, that's going to be costing them hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars. And it only works if other companies are doing the same thing. So it's a kind of after-you situation. Nobody wants to be the first mover, spend the money, and then discover that no one else is doing the same. So we automatically get kind of delay. And there's a worse problem, which I've already mentioned too. In some cases, it's a question of market power. Lowering barriers to entry is not something that companies ideally welcome. So yes, it can reduce operating costs, but there can be huge resistance. I've used the title, The Tragedy of the Commons, because this is in a way similar to the well-known economic issue of the tragedy of the commons. So for those who are not familiar with it, it's the phrase that we think of as a very traditional English situation, where we have, back in the old days of villages, before we all moved into towns, we had common land, which was grazed, so the peasant farmers would take their sheep or their goats or whatever and graze them on the common land. Now, there were rules to prevent it, but the problem with common land is that the economic incentives are for overgrazing. It's an externality, for ignoring the costs. If my sheep graze on the land and they take all the grass away, that's a cost for others who come later than me. But there's no incentive unless we have cultural institutional arrangements to internalize that externality. The barriers to standards adoption are similar. We need to internalize the network externalities that are inherent in standards. My final slide, similar to the first one. So I view, just to summarize in the last minute and a half, I view financial alliance as a collective arrangement where the industry, together with the political establishment, together with the wider societal stakeholders, at national and also international level, work together to improve the functioning of the competitive market. And in particular, I've argued we should be making an objective of financial alliance the promotion of operational and data standards to make everything as seamless as our mobile phones and cost-free. And yes, that will reduce barriers to entry. Yes, some firms will lose out as well as others will gain. But ultimately, their shareholders will be the winners, not just their customers, because it's a way of creating sustainable growth for the future. That's where it links back to my title. Okay, I've left myself with just less than a minute, a very quick summary. So as I say, financial alliance is a collective arrangement to overcome the weaknesses of the competitive market. I've talked about Web 3.0. I've compared with telecommunications, using my family example of Samsung, against financial services. And if I weigh it in the balance, financial services don't seem to be very good at standardization, for understandable reasons. but I think it's something that should be corrected. And I've discussed 4 examples, one very successful, ISO 20022, but 3 others less well known, which really need support globally. And finally, I've touched on this key challenge of standards adoption. We know there's tremendous benefits, but achieving them will require a lot of coordination. It's not going to be quick, it's not going to be easy, but it's well worth trying. Thank you.